Hello you all and welcome back to Living Unveiled with Maddie. As we begin to round off this Red Light Movement series, I want to bring us back to something we promised to talk about earlier. What is actually happening to marriages, especially among families in the diaspora? Because many of the pressures that destroy marriages do not arrive loudly. They arrive quietly. They begin with small shifts, small resentments, small changes in perspective, small compromises in how we see each other. And before long, what started as something small becomes something destructive. And that is why scripture warns us in Songs of Solomon 2:15. Catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that spoil the vines, for our vines have tender grapes. The vine is the marriage, and the foxes are the little things that we ignore until they grow large enough to destroy the relationship. When many couples leave home and move abroad, they often come with dreams of opportunities, stability, and a better life. And in many ways, those opportunities do exist. But along with those opportunities come pressure that many couples are really not prepared for. Because the environment changes, there's a culture shift, the expectations change, the support system that once surrounded the marriage disappears. And suddenly the marriage is placed under a level of strain it has never experienced before. Studies have consistently shown that immigration and relocation can place enormous pressure on marriages. Research across North America and Europe, for instance, have shown that immigrant families often experience significantly higher levels of marital stress during the first years of settlement. Financial instability, career disruption, cultural adjustment, and isolation all contribute to tension inside the home. But beyond these pressures, there is another dynamic that quietly reshapes many marriages in the diaspora. It is the semblance of economic power that can emerge when a woman suddenly finds herself with financial independence in a new system. In many Western societies, economic structure gives individuals, particularly women, access to income, legal protection, and social systems that did not exist in the same way back home. On the surface, this appears empowering, and in many ways it can be. But when that shift happens inside a marriage without spiritual maturity and humility, it can create a subtle but dangerous change in perception. The husband who once carried visible authority may now appear diminished. The wife who once endured certain frustrations may suddenly feel she no longer has to tolerate anything she dislikes. And what begins as empowerment can slowly become intolerance. Small disagreements begin to feel unacceptable. Patience becomes thinner. Respect begins to erode. And yet, scripture reminds us in Proverbs 14, verse 1, the wise woman builds a house, but the foolish tears it down with her own hands. And the responsibility is not only on the women. Men also must recognize the pressures their wife carry and respond with understanding and sacrificial love. The Bible commands husbands in Colossians 3:19, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. And in 1 Peter 3:7, scripture warns us, husbands, in the same way be considerate as you live with your wives, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. When honor disappears on either side, something sacred begins to erode. Many people in the diaspora have witnessed this pattern. There are countless stories of couples who left their home countries together with strong marriages, only to find those marriages unraveling a few years later. You hear stories of group of friends, for instance, who migrated together, engineers, professionals, educated couples with bright futures, and then one by one, the marriages begin to collapse. Sometimes the pressures were financial, sometimes the stress of survival, created emotional distance. Sometimes the shift in power dynamics changes how couples view each other. But very often, the breakdown began with the little foxes, unaddressed frustrations, unspoken expectations, loss of honor, loss of patience, loss of covenant thinking. And before long, what once felt like an unbreakable bond becomes fragile. This is the red light moment, the moment where couples must pause and ask themselves deeper questions, not just who is right or who is winning the argument, but are we still honoring the covenant we made before God? Because when marriage is understood only as a contract between two individuals, it becomes easy to exit when circumstances change. But when marriage is understood as covenant before God, it carries a different weight. The prophet reminds us in Malachi 2:14, the Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth. She is your companion and your wife by covenant. So marriage is not just companionship, it is covenant. And covenant calls us to patience when emotions begin to fluctuate. Covenant calls us to humility when pride rises. Covenant calls us to faithfulness when pressure increases. And that is why Jesus himself said in Matthew 19:6, so they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Marriage should never be taken casually. Not because marriage itself is the ultimate goal, but because marriage is one of the ways that God teaches us the meaning of covenant. And covenant is the language of the kingdom. When we learn covenant in marriage, we begin to understand faithfulness. And when we understand faithfulness, we begin to understand Christ. Because the ultimate picture of covenant is Christ and his church. As Ephesians 5:25 says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So these red light moments are not meant to condemn anyone. They are meant to wake us up, to remind us to slow down, to examine the small foxes, to restore honor, to also restore patience, to restore covenant thinking before the vine is destroyed. Because one day, every earthly marriage will pass away, but the covenant between Christ and his church will remain forever. Scripture tells us in Revelations 19:7, it says, let us rejoice and be glad and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come and his bride has made herself ready. That reminds us that earthly marriage was never the final destination. It was only the preparation to understand covenants, to understand faithfulness, preparation to also understand the nature of the bridegroom. And that is why marriage should never be taken casually, because through it, God is teaching us the language of the kingdom and is also preparing a people who are ready for Christ. So as we close this red light moments, the warning is simple. Catch the little foxes. Honor the covenants. Guard your vine. Because a marriage that forgets covenants can easily fall apart. But a marriage that remembers God was there when the promise was made in the first place will never be taken lightly. And next time, we will go deeper. We will step away from the pressures and the symptoms we have been discussing, and we will begin to examine the foundation itself. We will take a deep dive into the covenant of marriage as God ordained it from the beginning. Because when covenant is understood the way God designed it, marriage stops being fragile. It becomes sacred. And when something is sacred, it is no longer treated casually. Until next time, stay unveiled.